Did one of the funniest cartoons ever made really become too dangerous for Saturday morning television? For millions of viewers, Roadrunner cartoons were childhood chaos in its purest form. Desert highways, impossible speed, Acme boxes, falling boulders, exploding rockets, and one stubborn coyote who somehow survived every disaster. But in the 1980s, something strange happened. The cartoons many people remembered from childhood suddenly felt different. Gags ended too early, explosions vanished, falls were shortened, some punchlines disappeared completely. Viewers were not imagining it. The Roadrunner cartoons had been cut, softened, and reshaped for a new television era that had become nervous about what children were watching. To understand why this happened, you have to go back to the beginning. The Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote first appeared in 1949 in Fast and Furious, directed by Chuck Jones and written by Michael Maltese. The setup was beautifully simple. A hungry coyote wanted to catch an impossibly fast bird. That was it. No complicated backstory, no speeches, no emotional explanation. Just pursuit, failure, and perfect timing. But behind that simplicity was a strict comic machine. The Roadrunner almost never harmed the coyote directly. The coyote's disasters came from his own plans, his own impatience, and his own faith in ridiculous Acme inventions. That was the genius. Wile E. Coyote was not just a cartoon villain, he was a tragic little engineer of his own humiliation. He ordered the rocket, he tested the catapult, he painted the tunnel, he trusted the explosive, he stepped onto the cliff edge. Every gag was a tiny story about ambition turning against itself. Children laughed because the violence was impossible and exaggerated. Adults laughed because the coyote looked like every overconfident person who thought the next clever idea would finally work. He was not evil, he was obsessed, and that made him strangely lovable. In theaters during the 50s and early 60s, these shorts played before feature films for audiences of all ages. Nobody treated them as a public danger. The coyote could fall thousands of feet, leave a perfect hole in the ground, get flattened into paper, or walk away blackened by an explosion, and the audience understood the rule. None of it was real. Cartoon physics had its own universe. Pain was temporary, gravity was theatrical. Death did not exist. The joke was not cruelty. The joke was that no matter how badly the coyote failed, he always came back for one more attempt. Then, television changed everything. When Warner Brothers cartoons moved from theaters into television packages, they became part of daily childhood. By the 60s and 70s, Roadrunner shorts were everywhere. Saturday mornings, weekday afternoons, local stations, and rerun blocks. Children were no longer seeing them occasionally in a theater with adults. They were seeing them repeatedly at home, often grouped with programming aimed directly at young audiences. The cartoons themselves had not changed, but the way people thought about them had. By the late 60s and 70s, America was becoming more anxious about screen violence. The concern was not only cartoons. Parents and educators worried about crime shows, westerns, war coverage, action series, and the rising amount of violent imagery on television. Advocacy groups began asking whether children were being shaped by what they watched. Groups such as Action for Children's Television pushed broadcasters to reduce violence, limit commercialism, and treat children's programming with more responsibility. Networks did not want government regulation, so they tried to prove they could police themselves. That is where standards and practices departments became powerful. These were the internal television gatekeepers who reviewed content and decided what could air. For children's programming, one question became especially important. Could a child imitate this? That single fear transformed the way older cartoons were judged. It was no longer enough to say, "This is obviously impossible." Editors began looking at the setup, not just the punchline. A cartoon character surviving dynamite was fantasy, but lighting a fuse looked like an action a child might copy. A coyote surviving electricity was absurd, but touching wires looked dangerous. A fall off a cliff was impossible for most children to recreate, but playing near roads, tracks, or heights suddenly looked risky. And here is the strangest part. The Roadrunner was never really the violent one. The coyote did almost everything to himself, and somehow he still became the problem. By the early 1980s, broadcasters faced a dilemma. The Roadrunner cartoons were valuable. They were popular, recognizable, cheap to rerun, and perfect for filling children's programming blocks. But they were also packed with the exact material nervous television executives were trying to reduce: dynamite, bombs, falling rocks, fire, electricity, sharp tools, railroad tracks, cliff falls. The very ingredients that made the cartoons unforgettable now looked like a checklist of imitable danger. So the networks did not simply throw the cartoons away. They cut them. The edits were not always consistent, and different stations sometimes aired different versions. But the pattern was clear. Dynamite gags were major targets. If Wile E. Coyote lit a fuse, carried explosives, planted a bomb, or got blasted by one of his own devices, the scene might be trimmed or removed. Fire gags could disappear, especially if they involved matches, flames, or the coyote being burned. Electrical gags were often shortened because they showed shocks, wires, or dangerous devices. Sharp objects, giant blades, scissors, or weapons could be removed. Long fall sequences might be shortened so the impact felt less intense. Even scenes involving roads, railroad tracks, or dangerous locations could be considered questionable. But Roadrunner comedy was not built to be chopped into pieces. These cartoons were timed like music. Every pause mattered. Every blink mattered. Every second before the disaster mattered. The coyote would hold up a sign, look at the audience, realize the ground was gone, and only then fall. That tiny delay was the joke. Remove the delay, and the fall becomes less funny. Remove the impact, and the setup loses its reward. Remove the explosion, and the fuse makes no sense. The cartoons still moved, but the rhythm was damaged. That is why many viewers felt something was wrong. A gag would begin, then suddenly jump forward. A scene would build toward a disaster, but the payoff would feel strangely weak. Parents who remembered earlier broadcasts noticed missing moments. Kids who only saw the edited versions still laughed, but they were often watching a softer, stranger version of the original. The Coyote's failures felt less catastrophic, and because they felt less catastrophic, they became less funny. The whole point of the Roadrunner formula was escalation. The Coyote did not just trip, he failed spectacularly. The irony is that the cartoons already had a kind of built-in moral lesson. Reckless behavior never worked. Every dangerous plan punished the person who created it. Wile E. Coyote never won because of explosives, rockets, or traps. He always lost because of them. In that sense, the shorts were not celebrating danger. They were making danger look foolish. But television censors were not analyzing the philosophy of Chuck Jones. They were responding to public pressure, parent complaints, advocacy groups, and the fear of being blamed if a child copied something from television. Chuck Jones understood what was being lost. His Roadrunner cartoons were not random violence, they were disciplined comedy. He had rules for the universe, and those rules kept the violence from feeling mean. The Roadrunner did not torture the coyote. The coyote's own obsession did that. The desert became a silent stage where failure repeated itself with endless invention. Cutting those gags was not like removing a throwaway moment from a cheap cartoon. It was like cutting beats out of a song. The shape remained, but the swing disappeared. That is why animation fans often saw the 80s edits as more than harmless trimming. To them, it felt like vandalism done in the name of safety. The editors were trying to remove dangerous content, but they were also removing timing, structure, and personality. Some shorts lost so much material that they barely worked. If a cartoon depended heavily on explosives, fire, or elaborate mechanical disasters, the edited version could become confusing. The setup remained, but the payoff was weakened or gone. A 7-minute masterpiece could suddenly feel like a 5-minute puzzle with missing pieces. The edits also reflected a larger cultural shift. The 1980s were full of protective anxieties around childhood. Parents worried about stranger danger, violent media, unsafe toys, and the influence of television. In that climate, old cartoons made in a more anarchic era suddenly looked irresponsible. Broadcasters wanted to appear careful. Advertisers wanted safe programming. Networks wanted to avoid controversy. So the easiest solution was not to defend the old cartoons as art. It was to quietly cut them. But the public mood did not stay the same forever. By the 90s, cable television and home video began changing how classic animation was seen. Channels like Cartoon Network and later Boomerang treated old Warner Brothers cartoons as part of animation history, not just disposable children's filler. More complete versions began to circulate again. Home video and DVD releases allowed fans to see the shorts closer to their original theatrical form. For some viewers, it was almost shocking. Suddenly, the timing made sense. The missing gags returned, the explosions landed, the falls breathed. The Coyote's misery became funny again because the rhythm had been restored. Looking back, the heavy editing of Roadrunner cartoons in the 1980s feels like a perfect example of how censorship can misunderstand comedy. The concern for children was not completely imaginary. Children do imitate things, and television does influence culture. But the solution was clumsy. It treated impossible cartoon slapstick like realistic instruction. It treated a self-defeating coyote like a dangerous role model. It treated fantasy physics like a safety manual gone wrong. The deeper truth is that Roadrunner cartoons were edited because they were too clear, too effective, and too unforgettable. A weaker cartoon might not have worried anyone, but Chuck Jones created gags so precise that every child understood them instantly. That was the brilliance. And in the nervous television climate of the 80s, that brilliance became the problem. The cartoons did not need dialogue. They did not need explanation. A rocket strapped to a coyote said everything. In the end, the Roadrunner shorts survived the edits, just like Wile E. Coyote survived every cliff. They were crushed, trimmed, softened, shortened, and still somehow kept going. But the uncut versions remind us why the originals mattered. Take away the danger, and you take away the timing. Take away the impact, and you take away the joke. Take away the coyote's ridiculous suffering, and you take away the strange, heroic madness that made him unforgettable. So why were the Roadrunner cartoons heavily edited in the 1980s? Because television stopped seeing them as theatrical slapstick and started treating them as children's safety hazards. Because networks feared complaints, regulation, and imitation. Because old cartoons were forced to obey new rules they were never designed for. But most of all, because adults looked at Wile E. Coyote falling off a cliff and forgot the most important thing. He was never supposed to be real. He was supposed to be impossible. And that impossibility was the whole magic. The 80s tried to make Wile E. Coyote safer, but the moment they softened the fall, they weakened the joke. Because Roadrunner cartoons were never about violence winning. They were about failure surviving. One cliff, one rocket, one terrible Acme idea at a time.